All right, Chapter 3, A Problem in the Neighborhood. As was their tradition to lie in bed and talk about what was going on in their lives before they drifted off to sleep, Susie was happy to have this alone time with her grandmother. She always found Granny Ella to have wonderful insights into the things that were important to her. Because her grandmother had seen so much of life and had been to so many unusual and amazing places, Susie knew she could ask her granny anything and get a fascinating story in response. Susie liked that her Granny Ella never told her what to do or what to think. However, her grandmother had an interesting habit of asking lots of questions that made Susie think about things differently. So Susie was not surprised when her granny said, "Sweetheart, how has your school year been going?" Even if her granny hadn't asked, Susie was going to tell her about a very special report she had written that she knew her grandmother would find most interesting. "Oh, Granny, I have spent a lot of time learning about Eleanor Roosevelt." Franklin D. Roosevelt, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's wife. What an amazing woman she was. Did you ever meet her? Granny Ella smiled and said, "Well, I never got to meet her, but the picture you have on your nightstand with my friends was taken back in 1948 after we heard Mrs. Roosevelt speak at a very famous meeting in Paris, France." Aha. She really changed the role of first ladies in our country. Those women who followed in her footsteps tried to do more than just look beautiful standing next to their presidential husbands. Susie was not surprised that her grandmother seemed to know so much about Mrs. Roosevelt. She asked Granny Ella, "Did you know that Mrs. Roosevelt resigned from one of the most famous organizations in the country, the Daughters of the American Revolution, because they would not allow Marian Anderson to sing at one of their meetings just because she was an African American? That's discrimination, and now it's against the law because of people like Eleanor Roosevelt." You're right, Susie, and did you know that when they refused to allow Mrs. Anderson to sing at Constitution Hall right here in Philadelphia, Mrs. Roosevelt arranged for her to sing in front of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. on Easter Sunday of that same year? You seem to know a little bit about that. Thousands more people got to hear her beautiful voice than would have if she had sung in Philadelphia. So in the end, things worked out in an amazing way. After the disgraceful incident with Marian Anderson, I remember listening to the radio and hearing Mrs. Roosevelt say, "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." Eleanor Roosevelt's actions during the 1930s and 40s inspired many people to stand up for their rights. This reminded Susie of something that had recently upset one of her friends. Wait till you hear this, Granny. After I read my report in class, Lois Bernstein rushed over to me at the lunch table, and she told me that her family wanted to join the Winhall Country Club where we all belong, and they were turned down. Her father told her it was because they were Jewish, and that no Jewish people were allowed to belong to that club. I can't believe it, right here in America, right here in Marion, Pennsylvania. Well, last year in history class, we learned that the founding fathers of our country came to America for religious freedom. They wanted the new land to welcome all kinds of people and make it possible for them to worship however they wanted. I also learned the Statue of Liberty is a symbol of that freedom, and people who have come to America from all over the world, like your family, Granny Ella, have been greeted in New York City Harbor by her promise of liberty. My teacher called it an appreciation of diversity, and it is part of what makes our country so great. For my friend's family to have these problems is like taking a giant step back in time. It made me so angry when I told my dad. He said he was going to look into it. "What do you think should be done if your dad finds out this is true?" her grandmother asked. "Do you think being angry will make a difference?" Eleanor Roosevelt said, "It's better to light a candle than to curse the darkness." What do you think that means? Better to light a candle than to curse the darkness.
Maybe to not complain so much because it's dark, and light a candle and solve the problem.
Solve the problem. Don't just sit there complaining. Do something about it. Good thinking, girls. That's such an amazing thing to think about. Sitting around being upset probably won't accomplish anything, Susie said. I bet if Eleanor Roosevelt were here, she would know what to do. I would love to be able to tell her about this. If she were still alive, I would write her a letter. One thing I do know, Susie said, if my friend isn't good enough for Winhill Country Club, then that club isn't good enough for me. I will never go there again. and they will lose the best swimmer on their team. A smile filled Granny Ella's face as she said, "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart." She continued to think about the stand her granddaughter was taking as the glow of the red shoes continued to light up the room. Granny Ella told Susie, "Just like Eleanor Roosevelt, I have always admired women who question things that did not make sense or seem unfair. Even though speaking out about things we feel are wrong might upset some people, as Mrs. Roosevelt said, what is to give light must endure the burning. You will have to be prepared for those people who do not agree with you, my dear." When Susie's eyes began to close, the last words she heard were those of her grandmother. She said, "Those of us who have the courage of our convictions make history, Susie." The room's red glow cast a comforting warmth and seemed to soothe these two special women as they began to drift off to sleep, the night before their birthdays. The last thing Granny Ella remembered was that Susie had forgotten to take off her shoes. So what do you think that could mean?
I'm not sure. Maybe it could like fade their shine or something and not make them shine as much.
In the middle of the night that they would slowly, with Susie being asleep, they might die down a little bit and not be so bright? Well, let's just see.